Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak. It has been about 1 week since the U.S. election, and many media outlets are calling that former Vice President Joe Biden is the presumptive winner. However, President Trump is contesting this election, and it is causing quite the controversy. Joining me now to discuss this election and what we can expect in the future is former 2016 presidential candidate with the Green Party, Jill Stein. Jill, I want to thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you, Taylor.
So I just want to begin by getting our viewers caught up on what is happening right now. So many media outlets are projecting that Joe Biden is the president-elect. However, there are some in the Republican Party who are not willing to acknowledge this. Do you think there is any reason to not acknowledge this and that perhaps there was some voter fraud or voter manipulation taking place?
So, to my understanding, at this point, all of the major media networks, including Fox News, have acknowledged that Joe Biden won, and he has a compelling win. By the popular vote, he has something like 75 million votes, I think, compared to almost 71 million for Donald Trump. So Biden has a clear majority in the votes. He also has, at this point, a very clear majority in the Electoral College. Trump is contesting many of those on every imaginable legal grounds. Several of those, including in Michigan, and at least one other state, have already been dismissed by the courts. And for all of Trump's accusations of fraud, there is no evidence of fraud or systematic or significant unusual evidence about events at the polls at this point. So basically is no evidence of fraud. Even George Bush has congratulated President-elect Biden. So I think, at least from the perspective here in this country, there doesn't seem to be much significant dispute to Biden's win, but it's not clear yet how the Trump resistance is going to roll out. So far, we haven't seen major scuffles in the street. We haven't seen major episodes of violence. There's been some massive police arrests of peaceful protests, I believe, in Philadelphia, but not really violent behavior that's been reported, at any rate, on the part of the Trump ground troops. So it could happen, and I think there's widespread vigilance about that right now.
Many people are also claiming that there was some sort of glitches with the voting system on election night, and that perhaps there was a wave of many votes for Joe Biden, and people are skeptical about this. Do you think they should be skeptical about this, or is this sort of an issue of perhaps the mail-in ballots, which we expected to be overwhelmingly in favor of Joe Biden?
Yes. I mean, I haven't seen anything that's inconsistent with the pattern that was expected, whereby Trump voters would take the lead initially because he's been really casting doubts and a very negative view of mail-in ballots without basis. There are many states that have relied almost entirely on mail-in ballots for many years. So Trump seems to have invented this convenient narrative to cast doubt on mail-in ballots, which essentially were used more by Democrats for a variety of reasons, including that Democrats take the COVID crisis seriously. So we're, very interested to avoid the issue of direct voting at the polls. So this was the kind of skew that one would have expected, and having run a recount in 3 states in 2016, I'm always on the lookout for significant red flags that would warrant a recount. And I'll just say that election integrity is always a concern, and we need to count every vote and ensure that every vote was counted accurately. But I think in this case, Donald Trump has been calling to stop the vote in states where he was still ahead and didn't want to lose his lead. He was calling to stop the vote in some places and to recount the vote where he had already lost and wanted to change it. So it's an extremely, shall we say, opportunistic approach to election integrity. We could have another conversation about the improvements that are needed, but essentially every vote should be subjected to what are called risk-limiting audits, whereby the vote is actually checked against paper ballots themselves to ensure that the vote is accurate. Unfortunately, we don't have that system in place yet, but that should be where we're going.
Before we do get to election reform, which is something that I do want to discuss, I wanted your opinion on the Transition Integrity Project. This was created out of concern that the Trump administration would not concede the election should he lose and be defeated in 2020. And this project involved many people who are very close to the establishment Democratic Party and have ties to the Clintons as well. And people have really been looking at this project and wondering, is the true intent here to perhaps ensure that we have fair and free elections?
I'm not familiar enough with the project to be able to comment on it. But, there have been many challenges to free and fair elections that include not only details of how the elections are administered, but to systematic voter suppression across the board. When the elites from the Democratic and Republican parties get together, I think, a red flag should go up. They haven't traditionally been the, leading the charge for election integrity. Notably in the 2000 fiasco when the vote was stopped, the vote count, a recount, which was really critical at that time, was basically stopped by the Supreme Court. Al Gore and the Democrats basically just acquiesced to it, even though it was really it was an outrageous manipulation of a vote count, a recount that was actually moving into Gore's direction. But the Supreme Court stopped it, and the Democrats were just kind of silent. In the same way, in 2016, there were significant questions, and the Democrats sort of sat on the sidelines on that one as well. So their track record hasn't been particularly exemplary. This is something that's been far better attended to by the grassroots election integrity activists.
Yeah, so that brings me to this next question. You recently posted on social media that, quote, "It's time to let people vote for what they want instead of against what they fear. Let's pass ranked choice voting everywhere. More voices, more choices, more democracy," end quote. You have been an advocate for ranked choice voting. Can you explain to the viewers what that is, how it works, and why it will help solve perhaps many of the problems that we have in our two-party system?
Yes. So for people who are familiar with how voting works in this country, it's what's called like a first past the post or a plurality voting system. It means that whoever comes out ahead, even if it's just 25% of the vote, they're going to be declared the winner of the election. So people wind up sort of taking this strategy, this lesser evil strategy, basically, sort of letting Democrats and Republicans define who the leading candidates are, who are usually funded by the same suspects, the usual suspects, Wall Street and the war machine, and a few others thrown in there, financial industry, insurance companies, pharmaceuticals, etc., real estate developers. These are usually where the money is and the power is behind the two leading candidates. And then people tend to not particularly like either of them, as in this election. Certainly in 2016, it was really well documented. And people generally vote for so-called the lesser evil, where you're not really voting for what you want, you're voting against what you're really afraid of. So how do we ever guide our democracy forward in that kind of situation? And we never get to really express our values or have a moral compass to our political system. That just all kind of goes away. So under ranked choice voting, you never have to worry about, quote, throwing your vote away on someone who can't win. You have every reason to express your values, and you never have to worry about so-called spoiling the election by so-called taking votes away from a corporate party. The whole idea that the two corporate candidates own our votes and to express our own heartfelt beliefs is wrong or inappropriate, that we owe our votes to the candidates controlled by corporate America and Wall Street. That's just a preposterous and very arrogant notion from the get-go. And if we had a ranked choice voting system, there's none of that presumption that you have to vote for one of the big two, and that voting your values is a bad thing to do. And that allows us to have many contenders. The fear of the so-called spoiler now is used to suppress dialogue. If you look at, for example, how Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard and I, myself, we were all smeared as Russian tools, Putin's puppets, for promoting an anti-war agenda. That's how the parties of war in Wall Street silence the debate, because they know that the public doesn't buy into this war. The public wants to reduce the military expenditures, not increase them, and wants to solve our foreign policy issues through diplomacy and through human rights and international law, not through the exercise of raw military and economic power, how we currently do it. So, these are really important ideas. We can begin to put them back on the table and actually have a real debate about the policy issues that are critical to not just a just future, but a future in which we can all survive.
These are really great points, and I want you to explain to our viewers, if you can, because you have been through this yourself. You ran as a third-party candidate during the 2016 U.S. presidential election. What is it like to run as an independent? And when I say independent, I mean not within the establishment in the two-party system. What is that like? And did you receive a lot of backlash? And were you criticized and told that you helped get Trump elected?
Yes, absolutely. The system has really been very hostile to independent third parties. Certainly going back to the 20s and 30s and the Red Scares and the effort to basically take the wind out of the sails of the movement for economic justice, basically an organized left. And there's been war on unions. There's been a war on working people ever since the New Deal in the 1930s and the 1940s, ever since there was a response to the Great Depression. There has been really a systematic war on the left, and that has included making it almost impossible to even get on the ballot. We talk about the suppression of alternative parties in Russia and in authoritarian countries or in Iran, but unfortunately, we're an example of the same thing. It's very hard. We have to get hundreds of thousands of signatures in many states. It amounts to millions of signatures across the country just in order to be a contender. And independent third parties have been systematically beaten back and smeared as, Putin puppets, secret commies, etc., ever since, again, since the early 1900s. Some of this was demonstrated at the end of the Second World War, when Henry Wallace, who was the vice president under FDR, was about to be nominated for vice president in 1942 or 44, I forget which year, but it was the last election in which FDR was going to run. It was known he wasn't going to survive. And so Henry Wallace was about to be nominated, and a fire alarm was pulled, and a fire emergency was declared in order to prevent his nominator from getting to the microphone. And the Democratic Party has basically been pulling that fire alarm ever since. I mean, you can just look at the way that Bernie Sanders had a victory in this primary election snatched out of his hands by really a manipulation of the Democratic Party candidates, particularly by Barack Obama, who had conversations with people, convinced all the other contenders really to drop out, with the exception of Elizabeth Warren, who constituted another kind of competitor with Bernie Sanders to allow Joe Biden to win the nomination. So, it's gone on really without exception for a very long time. And it's clear that there has really been a war on independent third parties that takes many forms, including, the power of money to buy our elections, to buy media, the exclusion from the ballot, the control of the presidential debates by a private corporation run by the Democratic and Republican parties, so that voters are denied their right to other voices and other choices. Just this past September, just coming into this election, a poll was taken, and I believe this was partly sponsored by the Wall Street Journal, so this was not some radical poll, and it found that 62% or 63% of Americans, even in the current hyper-partisan environment, even at this time, Americans are calling for an independent political party separate from the Democrats and Republicans that the public feels is incapable of governing, certainly on behalf of the public. About a year ago, there was another poll done that showed 70% of Americans were not just fed up with the political establishment, they were actually fighting angry and expressed that view of being angry at both political parties. And when people are being systematically thrown under the bus, as they have been, not just by Republicans, which they certainly are, but by Democrats as well, who give lip service to a more progressive view, but Obama, threw working people under the bus, threw trillions of dollars at Wall Street to bail out Wall Street, while 5 million people had their homes stolen away from them and were basically thrown out in the street, and economic disparities hit the roof to where the 0.1%, the very richest tippy top of the economic spectrum, now has the equivalent of what 90% have. So, people at the bottom are just taking it on the chin, have been thrown onto the bus, are extremely angry, yet the Democrats continue to sort of hijack resistance in the many ways that they do on a whole spectrum of issues. I think if there's a silver lining in this latest election, it's that the mask has really come off of the Democratic Party. Its neck was really saved by Black Lives Matter advocates who really got out the vote in Philadelphia, in Georgia in particular, in Detroit. In many of the swing states, a huge difference was made by people who've been mobilized by the uprising against white supremacy, and the call for Medicare for all and so on. That's really what has been the juice that saved the neck of the Democrats here. But they're using their poor showing in a campaign where Biden basically refused to establish positions on anything, or to advocate for them, at least in his campaign. The Democrats are seizing on the so-called radical left as an excuse to further silence them, after they've already been excluded at the Democratic Convention, which was really a symbol of where the Democratic Party is going. It's going to this milquetoast centrist position with Joe Biden's history of, having been on the wrong side of a whole lot of issues. Maybe we'll get to that later. Yeah. But it's clear it's a struggle being a third-party candidate. And I'll just say, yes, I've been attacked nonstop for having stood up. I consider that a badge of honor. And, I think I'm in very good company here. Sanders has been smeared, Tulsi Gabbard's been smeared, not to mention, a whole variety of whistleblowers and others who are really under consistent attack. But I think the mask has come off of the Democratic Party. It's clear that they are not going to do what it takes. In the absence of an organized left and a real voice for the left, it's very easy for the outrage, which is pervasive right now, that outrage gets diverted into right-wing extremism. So it's really important that we stand up and fight for the future we deserve.
Okay, Jill, why don't we take a brief pause, and when we return, we will continue with our discussion on this recent presidential election with a focus on Joe Biden and his policies. But first, check out this commercial.
Pure journalism. Every journalist in the world should have been cheering Edward Snowden. He did what every journalist is supposed to be devoted to.
Because we have evidence that when we do that, things go wrong.
Welcome back to The Source. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak. So Jill, I do want to talk about the similarities between the two parties, and I also want your perspective on Joe Biden and his history in politics. But before we do that, you put out a quote on Twitter that I think really resonates with a lot of people who are on the progressive left. You said, quote, "Reality check. A Biden win is a return to neoliberalism that gave us Trump. Biden will fulfill his promise to billionaire donors. Nothing will fundamentally change unless we build real people power now beyond the parties of war and Wall Street." So do you caution those, perhaps, who are too overly optimistic about a Biden presidency?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's really important not to drink the Kool-Aid, which is really being forced down our throats all over the place right now. Joe Biden, maybe his selling point is that, he's not he doesn't come across as an elitist, and he really doesn't have, he's not an Ivy League trained, CEO. And he seems approachable and he seems like a nice guy. That's his kind of public persona. But if you actually look at what he does, people should have good reason to be alarmed. Going back to the 1994 omnibus crime bill, he established the legislation that massively amplified mass incarceration, that doubled and tripled the numbers behind bars, especially people of color, that tripled and quadrupled the length of sentences, and he provided a whole lot of racist rhetoric to go with that. He was an opponent of busing. He was a good friend of some of the worst blue dog Democrats and segregationists in Congress to help pass some of this legislation. He was a major proponent of the war and attack and the attack on Iraq. He, in the 2005 bankruptcy bill, he basically sabotaged people into student debt and made it impossible for bankruptcy protections to apply to, tens of millions of people who are now lifelong indentured servants to student debt. He has not stood up. I mean, it'd be hard to find a single instance, actually, of where he has stood up. He's declared his opposition to Medicare for All and said that if it was passed in Congress, he would veto it. And he's also declared that he's an opponent of the Green New Deal. He's given lip service to green energy, saying that he would stop fracking on public lands. Well, great, that's 10% of fracking. You're not going to get to a Green New Deal. You're not going to get to even their weak target of zero, basically carbon neutrality, effectively zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is a weak and ineffective target. We've got to be to zero by 2030 if we really want to avoid climate catastrophe. That's just the reality of it. And we're kind of seeing climate catastrophe breaking out all around us. There's no reason to doubt the science here. So, Joe Biden has been at best a lip service proponent of the things that people are hoping for. if there's a benefit here, is that we don't have to listen to the incredibly abrasive and outrageous rants of a narcissistic racist, and that's kind of nice. It was really enjoyable, actually, to hear the acceptance speeches on, what was it, Saturday night. It was actually kind of great to be able to listen to someone and not totally, tear your hair out. But I have to say, I can't really celebrate knowing that this is lip service and what the track record is and how progressives were really sabotaged to bring Joe Biden both to his nomination and then in the election, it was really, statistics showed, I think it was somewhere in the mid-60s% of people who supported Biden were not for Biden. They were really against Trump. So that's great that people have thrown off the yoke of Trump, but I can't stress strongly enough what a number of analysts are saying, and that is that if we don't have an organized left, the outrage here is very vulnerable to further demagoguery from the right. Donald Trump's not going anywhere, unfortunately. He's still got his Twitter. He may be doing big media. And who knows if he's even going to, go out of the White House without a fight. Who knows what's in store. But there's no reason here, I think, to relax either that, to think that Trump is gone or to think that the Democrats have put up an effective opposition. They are not an opposition, and they're very much what gave us Trump. So we really have to stand up here for an agenda for people, planet, and peace over profit.
I think that perhaps the establishment media is going to fall asleep once Joe Biden is in the Oval Office, if he is elected again. I'm just cautious with my language as a journalist because we still are not 100% sure yet. But let's say Joe Biden does get inaugurated, he is in office. Do you worry that the corporate media is going to sort of fall asleep and not hold him to account on the issues similar to what happened during the Obama years?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think there's not much hope, actually, for the corporate media, which is why I think what activism does, what this station does, what your program does is so critically important, because corporate media isn't just asleep at the wheel. They are driving hard in the wrong direction right now. They very much benefit from this consolidation of power, and they are they're making out like bandits here with the political system that we have. So it's very much in the hands, I think, of independent media and grassroots communication and organizing. I think we really have to, take to heart the examples of Chile and Bolivia, which recently overthrew right-wing extremism through basically grassroots activism and grassroots organizing. And I think the examples of the Black Lives Matter and the anti-police violence movements, which it's probably the biggest movement that's ever happened in the United States. Tens of millions of people have been consistently brought out into the streets. I think that's where the energy lies, and it's really important that not be co-opted, which the Democrats are so good at doing, is to kind of co-opt these struggles and then plug them into candidates who will then betray people and really not stand up for the deep change that we need.
And it's actually the establishment Democrats who are pushing for more censorship in cooperation with the mainstream social media outlets like Twitter and Facebook. Do you worry that censorship may get worse under a Joe Biden presidency?
Absolutely. And, I think censorship goes hand in hand with this broader era of McCarthyism that we're experiencing now, where you have both resurgent political oppression, that is repression of opposition politics. That's really much more intense than it was, say, even in 2016. So it's political repression and it's warmongering. we've got cheerleaders for the Cold War now, arguably more on the side of the Democrats than the Republicans, both against, particularly against Russia, but to some extent against China too, and which is extremely dangerous and irresponsible and reckless and all that. And the third piece is the censorship. So the three things go hand in hand, which to my mind makes it really important. We can't fight these things one at a time. In the same way that Martin Luther King articulated this, what he called the evil triad, that is militarism, hypermaterialism, or you could call it end-stage capitalism, and racism. They really all go together. You can't fix one without fixing all three. They very much feed off of each other and depend on each other. So we really, we need a convergent movement, which also needs to be active at the polls and not hijacked by the Democratic Party's apologist narratives. And, if there's a larger trend here, it's that money and power has become so hyper-concentrated. And this has been a steady trend over the course of decades. Starting, I believe, in like the 1990s, under Bill Clinton, the Democrats were had fully adopted a political strategy of fundraising from big money, with the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, and so on. So you had really the Democratic Party adopting the same fundraising strategy as the Republicans. So they then began to kind of compete for the big donor space. And that's still where they are. And they compete by providing concessions to the ultra wealthy, to Wall Street and the war machine. And so we've seen power concentrate and wealth concentrate. As long as you have so much concentrated wealth, it's very hard to prevent political corruption and the concentration of political power. So it's really important that we fight that. I think there's just not a prayer in the world that the Democrats are going to do this. I think, sure, go ahead and fight for it. But this is another advantage of ranked choice voting. It lets us collaborate across party lines so that we can work with a good cop, bad cop for those who are still, sentimentally married to the Democratic Party, as a lot of people are, because they remember what it used to be rather than what it is now, the party of, billionaires and bankers. We need a lot of collaboration across the party lines, but it really has to be led by political independence.
I do want to touch on foreign policy. Of course, this was something that was not discussed during the debates. Who do you think is better on foreign policy?
I think we're choosing between a neo-fascist and a neoliberal. And the problem is that we have a system that limits us to two unacceptable choices. And I personally find Trump's, unpredictability and his demonstrable craziness very unnerving, because you never know what he's going to do next. And he's all over the map. Granted, we've not had a new major war in the last 4 years. That's great, but I wouldn't, hold my breath that it would continue that way, because he's certainly, he loves to scream and threaten and, kind of drop a bomb here and there. And, truth to tell, I think lots more bombs have been dropped under Trump. And, he hasn't done many of the things he's given lip service to, like withdrawing troops, or he's just done it a tiny bit, nothing really reasonable. And while he pretended to have a dialogue with North Korea, that fell apart. He's just, there's really no basis for a rational foreign policy under Donald Trump. So I do find him quite frightening, and I would rather, I hesitate to even express an opinion about it, because I think it's the wrong debate to be having. Neither of these options is going to get us where we need to go. Neither of them is going to get us to a foreign policy based on international law, which has been systematically destroyed by both of them, human rights and diplomacy. Joe Biden did give lip service to diplomacy and to rebuilding the State Department, which would be a good thing. But if you look at who his list of potential appointments are, it's pretty terrifying. And at the head of the list for some of the key appointments are Susan Rice, who basically negotiated UN support for the disastrous U.S. policy in Libya, who's basically been an advocate for every war, that's occurred on her time. And Michelle Flournoy is one of the, I think, most shocking and worrisome potential appointments for Secretary of Defense, where, she's been kind of she was one of the leading proponents of the new U.S. ideology of endless war and basically declaring our independence from international law that says unilateral, unprovoked attacks on other countries because you define their oil as your vital interest. That's not okay. She basically said, no, I think that's fine. And, the judges at Nuremberg would not agree with her. And, I think she's sort of helped lead us into a foreign policy which basically based on war crimes. So Joe Biden's lip service has, lulled some people into celebration, but it's really important not to take your eye off the ball. We're in an extremely perilous moment, and it's really important to remember how we got to the rise of this demagogue. It's by, the systematic throwing under the bus of working people, and Joe Biden has just been one of the leaders of that charge.
I think that's a really great point that you make, and it really goes to show that nothing will fundamentally change under Democratic or Republican leadership. Now I do want to switch topics a bit and talk about Biden's cognitive state. This has been of concern to many Americans, and I think it was addressed more frequently during the primaries. And to be clear, I am being very sensitive to this issue that something could be going on now. This is not to make fun of Biden, but I think it's important that we do talk about his mental state because he is potentially going to be one of the most powerful people in the world. So I think it's reasonable to have this discussion. But before that, I do want to play this short clip for our viewers. This is from journalist and YouTuber Matt Orfalea.
I'm running as a proud Democrat for the Senate.
We have to take care of the cure. That will make the problem worse no matter what.
We should make sure that we have no one going to jail for a drug offense. They go directly mandatory prison.
Play the radio. Make sure the television, make sure you have the record player on at night. The phone. Make sure the kids hear words.
I got hairy legs that turn blonde in the sun.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing. You know how we talk about it. Are we the people?
Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
Together, we can work toward racial justice, economic injustice.
I'll lead an effective strategy to mobilize true international effort to pressure. God protect. Thank you. Which way am I going?
So obviously in that video, we see Joe Biden make several gaffes. And of course, he's not the only politician that does this. We've seen it from many of them. Are you concerned, though, about Biden's ability to lead and make decisions and work with foreign leaders?
Well, yes, I am. But truth to tell, I'm more concerned based on his actual history and his performance than on what you could charitably call his gaffes, or call it his, his up and down, performance, cognitive performance, or whatever you want to call it. If you compare him with Donald Trump, truth to tell, I'm much more alarmed about Donald Trump's, and I wouldn't call them gaffes. I'd say, his intentional viciousness and irrationality. I find that actually of more concern than Biden's lapses, and he had a lot of lapses during the primary. He didn't during the general election. Now, that may be just because he was less out there, less on the stump. But, he and Trump are both older people that are not apparently in the greatest health. Donald Trump has obviously many health impairments, which are evident. And his mental health is also in an extremely alarming state. Yeah, I would greatly have preferred Bernie Sanders be where Joe Biden is right now, but considering who the options are, I'm not so worried about his mental health. Maybe he was taken better care of during the general election than during the primary, and we know that people who are older are always subject to cognitive lapses, and that, in fact, the last time I looked at the data, there was a lot to suggest, and this is like the science data on cognitive decline. There's a lot to suggest that it's not an immutable course, that, in fact, one's state of health, especially in senior years, is very subject to environmental conditions. That is, nutrition and sleep and stress and things of that nature. So, it may be that if he has the proper conditions around him, he can do a better job than what your video showed. I'm hopeful that's the case, but in any event, I'm actually even more worried about Donald Trump's mental health and cognitive state than even Joe Biden's.
Do you think that the progressives in the Democratic Party could push Biden to the left, and what is their role within the party now?
I think it's really important to try, but it's important to say, as Frederick Douglass articulated, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. You can't get concessions by just coming on bended knee and saying, I'm going to support you. And unfortunately, that was the approach. And that was very much Democratic Party strategy, was to silence progressives and to silence dissent. They orchestrated his victory in the primary, and then they basically enforced, this monotone of support across the Democratic Party during the election. So now it becomes very hard. Now that power is in his hands, it's very hard to demand concessions. It's going to be really hard. But that is the only hope, because it's not, power concedes nothing unless you really force it to. And it just, again, look at the Democratic National Convention, where they paraded one Republican after another, Cindy McCain, the former governor of Ohio, Kasich, and who are all now slapping the hands of Black Lives Matter and you socialists, and you almost lost us the election. No, actually, it was them that almost lost us the election. And exit polls have showed that large numbers of voters were motivated by economic concerns, and almost all of them, something like 83% of people who said that their leading concern was the economy, they almost all went to Trump, because Biden hasn't offered anything except basically platitudes, not, a real health care plan. He wouldn't even talk about the public option, which is a non-sustainable form of health care as a human right. It's not economically sustainable, but even that he had on his website, but he didn't talk about it at all. He basically talked about supporting the Affordable Care Act, which is actually not very popular. Public opinion is pretty divided on it. People would rather have it than not at all. But, the point being, there was a real lack of substance in the campaign, and progressives were shut out during the campaign. They were shut down in the primary. They were shut out in the Democratic National Convention, and now they're being told to be quiet. And there have been some major, debates inside of I shouldn't even call them the debates. They're really attacks going on now inside the Democratic Party within their within the party caucus. It was basically leaked that there was a huge attack on progressives. AOC is being targeted by the Lincoln Project, which is essentially Republicans that are appealing to other Republican elites. They didn't succeed by any measure. If you look at actually the exit polls, they did not increase Republican support in this presidential election over 2016, but they ate up a huge amount of progressive money, like some $50 million, into their ads, which were effective if you already agreed with them, and they sort of emphasize the centrist point of view here. So the attack is going full bore right now against progressives, and it's really important, I think, to take the advice to heart from Frederick Douglass that we have to stand up and be for what we're for. And if you silence opposition parties, then there is no threat. There is no threat to make power move. So it's really important. I would encourage any progressive who wants to hold sway inside the Democratic Party to really fight for ranked choice voting and to get it passed. It passed in 5 more cities in this last election. And it continues to have a lot of momentum. It was just adopted by New York City last year and so on. So it's really going full steam, and people very much are, enthusiastic for it when they actually have the chance to vote. And more people come out to vote. There's greater diversity and dialogue. There's, smearing pretty much goes away. So it's really important for people who hope to have any traction within the Democratic Party. You have to have the so-called bad cop outside of the party if you want to have a hope of making progress within the Democratic Party.
Exactly, and I think ranked choice voting would really excite a lot of voters to get out there and vote, because there is perhaps a chance that a third-party candidate can actually win the election, when now, of course, with our system that we have in place, it's really, really difficult, almost impossible. Which also brings me to another question I have for you concerning the Green Party. What is your perspective on the future of the party and how they ran this past presidential race?
So let me just say first off that every non-corporate independent party since really the Second World War, or since the socialists were beat back, no independent non-corporate party has survived really for longer than 10 years. You can look at the Labor Party, which was launched at the same time as the Greens, with far more institutional and structural support, money from labor and so on. They could never get out of the starting gate. They were unable to run a single candidate, and they have effectively disbanded. Or you could look at the Peace and Freedom Party, which had a very similar agenda to Greens, and they held sway, had access to the ballot in maybe 15 states in their heyday, something like that. Now they're beaten back to 1 state. You could look at the New Party, or the Working Families Party, which has basically become now an appendage of the Democratic Party, and just allows Democrats to run on a so-called independent line, which is not independent at all. So independent parties have a steep uphill climb, and they're generally wiped out within 10 years. The Greens have managed to survive for going on 3 decades now, and it's an up and down course. Money and power in the Democratic and Republican parties continues to fight us, to silence us, to lock us out of debates, and to smear us. And in the shadow of Donald Trump, with the incredible, terror that Trump inspires in a lot of people's hearts, this was an unbelievably difficult election to run. And, the Greens suffer for that and will suffer for that. However, they survived, and they still have, a very activist base across the country. We did get knocked off the ballot because that's how the rules of ballot access are defined. They are defined in such a way as to eliminate competition. So it's going to be harder to run. However, we're still able to run at the local level. And typically we win 20 into 25% of our local races. We have won many hundreds of offices over the course of the past 1 to 2 decades, and that still goes on, and we get better at it. We just had a 26-year-old Latinx mayor elected, an activist, Green, elected to a mayoral position in one of the cities in LA County. We have many city councilors, school committee members, and so on. So, I think having lost ballot status in many races now, I think the Greens are intensively focusing on local races, which is really where you have to build, and that's the work that lies ahead.
Now, one reason I think a lot of people went out to vote for Joe Biden is because of this pandemic. Many people felt that President Trump did not handle it appropriately. Joe Biden says that he will have a plan for mandatory masks to be mandated nationwide. He's denying that we're going to go into a potential lockdown. However, the CDC's numbers do show that this virus has a remarkable survival rate. You are a physician, so I think you have some authority on the subject here. Are you concerned at all that perhaps measures like track and trace could be used for more nefarious purposes within the government? A lot of people don't trust the government, and they worry that this is an infringement on their privacy, and that once COVID is not so much of a problem in our society, that these measures will still be in place, similar to what we saw with the Patriot Act and the measures that were put in place post 9/11.
I take those concerns very much to heart, at the same time that I take the public health concerns to heart. And, I don't think there is a simple solution here. I think that we need to rein in government abuses of privacy across the board, including in just how our Facebook and Twitter data is used and all that. If we could begin to take those abuses, to hold them in check, to hold the big tech companies and their abuses in check also, because they play right into each other, and government uses the data that's collected by Facebook and so on. We need protections for privacy across the board. If we could do that, we would have much better success if then our public health measures also took those privacy concerns to heart. And I would just say that South Korea, in particular, they've been able to use those kinds of measures. They have a very strong left in South Korea and a very strong labor movement. And I think they have much more faith in their government institutions because they have more integrity. I think we've got to take those issues on and confront them explicitly. I don't think we're going to get a handle on this unless we do that. And absolutely, masks, testing, tracing, and isolation are very important. But those also need additional policies as well. If you expect to be able to isolate people, we have to provide people the means of support. That means not only a Medicare for all type system, we also need a universal basic income, at least for the time during which we're fighting COVID. If we expect people to be able to isolate, then we've got to be able to provide them the economic means to do that. And it's been a horrible burden on working people. So many low-income working people, it's tens of millions that do not have, they don't have health care, they don't have worker protections for sick time and so on. So people are, they're being asked to sacrifice their economic survival in order to maintain their physical survival. So this is absolutely crazy. Biden has taken some steps, and he's promised some steps, but they don't do what we need to do. He hasn't talked about providing health care as a human right, and he's not talked about providing the economic replacements. He's just talking about masks and testing. for God's sake, that is not going to do it. So it's really important. There's some hopeful news just today about some preliminary results on a vaccine that, again, isn't going, even if this holds true, it's not going to be here tomorrow. It will, it could take a year or more to roll it out. So it's not an immediate solution. But we're not just going to solve this with technology. We've got to solve it also by providing social and economic justice as a piece of the solution.
Right. Would you consider it to be a violation of people's privacy to require them to provide, say, their name and their phone number every place they went because of this virus? Again, when the CDC's own stats show that it has a pretty high survival rate in the 90s, like 99.9 something percent. I don't know the exact figure, but do you see that that's perhaps an overreaction, having to give your name, having to give your phone number and who you've been in contact with?
So I guess it depends who you're giving it to and what kinds of privacy protections surround that. I will say that testing and tracing looks like it's essential here. And historically, it's been essential to get a handle on pandemics and to stop them. So I think it's likely that we're going to need information and tracing to do this, but it has to be done in a way that reassures people. And I don't think we can create privacy rights in one little tiny, microcosm, just in the world of public health, if we're not also advancing privacy rights more broadly on the internet and with big tech and government in general.
Are you hopeful that there may be more privacy protections for the people in the future, and even beyond just COVID, but with Twitter and Facebook, or are you more pessimistic?
I think, personally, I think that big tech is a monopoly that will continue to abuse power. I think it's hopeful that the issue of their monopoly power has been raised by Congress. But big tech was one of the big funders of the Biden campaign. So I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see Biden move in the right direction. And, my iPhone now, it surprised me the other day by sorting my pictures and just automatically telling me, you have so many pictures of this person, you have so many pictures of this person. I mean, that artificial intelligence is here, is everywhere. Big tech is insinuating itself into all kinds of private corners of our lives, and we need a big solution here to big tech. And I think the overarching solution, again, is a coalition for social action and political action through independent politics, a politics of people, planet, and peace over profit. I think the makings of that are really coming together, and I think the mask is coming off of the Democratic Party, that it just doesn't have what it takes because it's funded by the same, malevolent forces as the Republicans, who are also, throwing our future over the cliff here. So, I think this is an existential moment in just about every imaginable way, and that's a very motivating condition. We see really vibrant social movements right now, particularly Black Lives Matter, but also the youth climate movement and the school climate strike, the union movement, the potential fight against evictions, which is another huge hammer that's about to fall. 40% of all people who rent their dwellings are at risk for losing their homes now. So I think the crisis, there's all this kind of misleading superficial data that says that the unemployment rate is coming down. The stock market is going off the charts right now. But these aren't real indicators. Rick Wolf says our unemployment rate, Chris Hedges, they agree it's more like 20%. This is Great Depression era misery right now. The bread lines with automobiles are 3 and 4 miles long. hunger is stalking the land, and widespread evictions are around the corner. So, these are very scary times. And yet, our billionaires have added $1 trillion to their wealth just since COVID, while misery is inflicted on just about everybody else. And $1 trillion in our budget is still being poured into the military-industrial complex, and nuclear weapons are on the rise again. There's a new nuclear arms race. So I think the existential threats really to everybody right now are compelling a new analysis, and those existential threats are really they've hit now right close to home, where people live, on our kitchen tables. And this is going to be a very mobilizing moment. The Democrats are clearly not prepared to do what it takes. They just want to get closer to Republicans right now. And that's the message that they're trying to promote. So I think this is a really important time to stand up with the courage of our convictions and, to take the future back into our hands. We can create an America and a world that works for all of us. It's the only world that's going to work for any of us in the end.
So I do want to ask you one last question. You have been a very vocal defender of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. Now, Trump has alluded to potentially pardoning Snowden. It's unclear if that will actually happen. And then also, too, some people are suggesting that perhaps Trump could pardon Assange just to sort of stick it to the Democratic Party. However, it is the Trump administration's DOJ that is prosecuting Assange. And it came out during this recent hearing that President Trump allegedly requested for Assange to be arrested. Are you hopeful for Assange's situation under the Biden presidency, or are you concerned that his prosecution will continue? And how do we fight this?
I'm very concerned. I haven't seen reason to think that Trump or Biden are going to have a change of heart. They seem very wedded to censorship in general, and I think the very notion of releasing someone who leaks national security information or who promotes that information. He's not accused of actually being the leaker, but rather promoting. He's a journalist and a publisher, which is why this is so dangerous, because if Julian Assange can be arrested by another government for exposing or for publishing information, previously leaked information, every journalist is absolutely at risk here. And I think, unfortunately, that's a notion that neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party seem to understand or care very much about, because they're all part of this new McCarthyism right now, and the warmongering, the censorship, and the political repression. So I think, again, it's in our hands to stand up against censorship and to support the independent media outlets, which are really a lifeline right now for the information on which our democracy depends.
Okay, Dr. Jill Stein, thank you.
Thank you. Great talking with you, Taylor.
And I want to thank you all for tuning in and watching this episode of The Source. Please make sure that you do subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure that you donate to our organization if you like the work that we do here and want to see us continue with our independent nonprofit news and analysis. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak, and I'll see you in my next report.